Welcome to another one of my videos. I'm Charles Bernard and I paint paperback book covers, and I also have an art school online called the Online Art Academy where I teach the fundamental principles that you're going to need to know if you don't know them, if you ever hope to become a real artist in the truest sense of the word. And this video is another long video. Now, these long videos are intended for the serious student of art. The serious student of art is that kind of person who has what Robert Henry called the art spirit within them, because they have the interest, desire, and will to want to learn as much as they can, as fast as they can, in order to become that really good or great artist that they so desire to be. I'm hoping that you're one of those art students that can watch a longer art instruction video, because you're going to be learning a lot more from longer art instruction videos, and you'll gain a better understanding of the subjects being taught. So, in this video, I'm going to be showing you a little bit about my process, and mainly it's going to be about this. Principles. What kind of principles? Well, of course, the principles of design and composition. What else? If you're an artist, that's what you need to learn about. And I'm going to talk about various principles that I'm going to be applying to a rough color sketch that I'm going to be doing. So, as you'll see, the way I start out is very simple, and then as the painting progresses, things become more interesting looking, shapes become more interesting looking. But in the beginning, things are kept rather simple. The shapes aren't as interesting as they will be later on, but that's how I start this particular rough color sketch that I'm going to be doing. So it's from more simple to more complex. Now, what is a principle? A principle of art is a rule of art. When you are applying the principles of design and composition, and actually, design and composition are basically the same thing. When you're designing, you're creating a composition. And when you are creating a composition, you are designing. You are designing that composition. So when you are applying the principles of design to your drawings and paintings, you are applying rules. And it is these rules or principles that govern the art. These principles of art must be grasped, understood, and applied. If you can't do that, your drawings and paintings will fall short of being art. The principles bring order to a composition. Without them, there is disorder, and disorder is not art. I'm going to show you a great illustration by Bernie Fuchs. He was one of the guiding faculty members for the famous artist school, where I also worked. And in this illustration, Bernie Fuchs used these principles of art that I'm talking about and that I'm going to be showing you in this video. And the reason why this painting looks so visually interesting and exciting is largely due to these principles that have been applied by Bernie. If you don't know the principles, if you don't understand them, if you can't apply them, you can't do art like this. Now, if you're an art student who hasn't really learned the principles of design and composition, and you're looking at an illustration like this, and you marvel at how beautiful it is, what you're seeing is an image. But what you're not seeing are the principles. If you don't know the principles, they remain hidden to you, not accessible to you. So you have to learn these principles. If you ever hope to produce anything near what Bernie did here, or what he did here. This may look rather simple, but it's not. It has a hidden complexity to it. Within this illustration, there are these principles that I'm talking about, just as they are in this illustration. While the subject matter of an illustration changes, the principles never change. the principles of art that make it possible to produce something like this. So if you don't know the principles, the image is seen, but the principles are not. So it's not until you know what these principles of design are that you then begin to see them in illustrations like this. These principles will never enter into your work unless you know them and are able to apply them. They won't appear miraculously by themselves. They won't appear through accident. They'll only appear through you knowing about them and understanding them and being able to apply them. That's the only way they're ever going to enter into your work. So underlying the images or subject matter of the illustration are the principles of design. The study of art is largely about learning these principles. And if you're not learning them, you're not gaining the kind of knowledge that will make it possible to produce an illustration like this, for example. Unless the principles of design are understood, art cannot be understood. So when you're looking at a great illustration like this, the principles of design are right there in front of you. But unless you know them, you don't see them. They remain invisible to you. So unless you're learning the principles of design, but not just those, other principles also, principles of light, principles of form, principles of perspective, and so on. Unless you're learning these principles, you're not really learning anything about picture making. And therefore, you're not yet an artist. And now I'm going to begin with my process here, and I'll be talking about some of these principles of design. In this video, I'm going to start out with not having any real idea in mind or some kind of message or meaning. Sometimes you can start out with really nothing in mind, and then as you continue to work, ideas come to you, and the composition begins to take form slowly, and you continue to add to it or take away from it, and eventually you come up with some kind of message or idea or emotional content. But it's usually better, in my opinion, to start with what the mood is or the emotional content is going to be. But like I said, in this video I'm starting out different, and also what I usually do is I make sketches, just quick little rough sketches of what I have in mind, and what the color scheme is, what the value pattern is, and so forth. So I might make little sketches like this, just thumbnail sketches. You see, something like that. But for this video, I'm not starting that way. But this is the better way to start, by first working out what the composition is, what the color pattern is going to be, the value pattern, and all those various things that are going to be part of your illustration. They need to be worked out in small, rough thumbnail sketches like this first, before you begin the painting. So in this video, I'm using that other approach, like I said. So let me get rid of this, and then I'm going to start. So here you see the color wheel. If you don't know the colors on the color wheel, you need to become familiar with them. At the top, yellow, then yellow-green, going to the right. Then the next one, green, then blue-green, then blue, blue-violet, violet, red-violet, red, red-orange, orange, and yellow-orange. It's a good idea to begin with a color wheel like this. When you're working out your color, have it next to your drawing or painting that you're going to be doing, like I have here. Then pick your color scheme from the color wheel. So for this rough sketch that I'm going to be doing, I think I'll be using yellow, and I'll just draw configuration yellow, then red, and then blue. The old triadic color scheme, red, yellow, and blue. Then add a toner to the ground, the surface on which you're going to be working. So I'm doing this quick and in real time. Make sure it's more grayed, like you see me selecting that color here with the little circle color selector. Too dark, way too dark. So I come up here, way too saturated, needs to be grayed, and that might be good. And I just go over the surface like this, really quick. Then after you've toned the surface, you do your drawing. So I'm thinking of a shack, and with a darker tone. So I'm going to draw that in, maybe right about here. Always put down the big shape first, big silhouette shape of this shack, something like that, and a small roof, and just a rough suggestion of a little bit of perspective, not too much. I don't want this to be too much of a 3D shack. I'm going to keep it, you know what, I'm going to keep it more flat. So I'm going to make that more narrow. I want more of a flat view, so I'm going to forget about the perspective there. And then maybe there's a tree over here in front of that shack, coming up like that, maybe, and over like this. So it's just a quick rough sketch, and maybe there's another building over here a little bit further back. Now you know what, it's attached to that building, I think. So what I'm going to do is something like this, keeping things more flat. And there's a field here, and let's say there's also a fence coming over toward those buildings. So I reduced its size, as you can see. I want more of the field down here. I want a greater area like that, in contrast to a smaller area up there like that. So after you have your drawing, you put in the local color and value of the objects. So to find the right color, use your color selector here and then just test it on your drawing to see if it's the right local color. And it's a red that I'm using. It's desaturated red, as you can see, and that's the local value also. And then also on the little building there that's attached to the big one, the same kind of local color and value. And then still using the same red, I'm going to darken it a little bit, desaturate it a little bit more, and let's say that is the roof. Not trying to be perfect here, as you can see. You can just rough it in at this stage. And as you can see, I've covered up the tree, but that's okay. I can paint that in later. And then I think I'm going to add the ground area. So I'm going to darken that a little bit, keeping things gray. That's way too dark, so you test it. Just test the value and color. And still too dark and gray. And that's a little too saturated, a little too dark. Let's see what that looks like. And maybe, no, maybe not, just a little bit lighter and a little more saturated, using a big brush strokes in the foreground, and then getting grayer and a bit more desaturated as the color goes back. So a little darker in the foreground, it's a little too much. Just mixing the gray, red together like this, keeping things really rough and loose, as you can see. If you tighten up too much in the beginning, and then later on you tighten up again, you're going to end up with a very tight and stiff looking painting. So something like this. I'm going to keep it dark pretty much everywhere, a little darker in the foreground. Now, a good idea is to start with the sky first, which I didn't do. So I should have put the sky color in first. And so, like I said, what you indicate, what you paint in are the local colors and local values. So I'm going to add the sky and very light, desaturated. That's way too saturated. Too dark. Too light. Too saturated. That's better. Keeping everything rough and loose. Why? Well, because I want the end result to be more loose and rough. I don't want perfect edges, perfect construction. I don't want that overly tight look. So next, it's the shadows, the darkest darks. So I'm going to pick up that local color on that shack and then come over to my color picker. So I selected a red that leans a bit toward the red violet, not that much, just a little bit, and darker and grayer for the shadow. And I also switched brushes. So now, let's see, something like this. And you can see that there's a shadow underneath the roof there. It gives it some depth. I'm going to pick up the color on the roof and put it over here on the little building right there, the same color. So I'm going to add a bit darker blue into the sky there. Create a slight gradation from dark on the left toward lighter value on the right. And a little bit of the warmer tone underneath is coming through. And I'm going to add a little bit more color variation to the ground area. So I'm going to pick up that color. And I'm going to add a little bit of red-orange. Now when I select the three colors, red, yellow, and blue, that doesn't mean that those are the only colors I use. I use other colors that are next to them as well to create color variety. But in addition to that, I also create variations of each of those colors, variations of the yellow, the red, and the blue in terms of their intensity and value. But for more hue variety, I need to add the adjacent colors to those colors. Like, for example, for the red, the adjacent color is red-orange, and the other one is red-violet. For the yellow, the adjacent colors are yellow-orange and then yellow-green. So I'm getting more color variety that way. So I can just go to my color wheel, pick up the red-orange here, and then where my color picker is, then I can move that around to gray it more, to lighten it more, to darken it more, whatever. I don't use the color the way it looks on the color wheel. That's just to get me started on the right color. So I'm going to move the little color selector down, and let's see. See, this color is a bit more saturated, not much. The idea is to keep everything more desaturated, so that there isn't one part of the painting that has saturated color to such a degree that it looks like it doesn't belong with the rest of the painting. There has to be this harmony of saturation of color Otherwise, if you have one color in there that's too strong, you destroy that harmony of intensity of color. Now, you can do that, of course, but when you do it, you're breaking a rule. And you have to know what you're doing when you're breaking rules. So as you can see, the warmer color and the bit more saturated color is placed in the foreground. And then I'm going to add a little bit of the red violet. So I'm going to pick that up from the color wheel. And move the little color selector around the color picker until I get the color I'm looking for. So further back, I add a little bit of that red violet, then also a little bit of the blue I'm going to add. So I'm going to pick up the blue from the color wheel, and I can change the blue. See, this is a bit more cyan blue. This is a bit more ultramarine blue. I use different blues, just like I use different reds, different yellows. So I'm adding a little bit of that blue back there, keeping it desaturated. Everything's more desaturated, more grayed. To warm up the sky a bit, you can add a little bit of the red-orange, just a little bit, so I can have the sky a bit warmer on the right side, a bit cooler on the left, so I could create color temperature gradation from cool to warmer. So I'm going to add a different blue to the sky. There needs to be a variety of blues, variety of reds, variety of yellows. Usually best to have two different blues if you're going to be using blues. Cyan, ultramarine are good, and then you create variations. And here you see on the right side in the sky it's a bit warmer and a bit cooler on the left side. And then some of that warmer color underneath is peeking through, some of that orange color. And some color adjustments always have to be made. You're never going to get the right color to begin with. In the beginning, it's going to be off. So I'm thinking of selecting that color on the shack. And then I'm going to darken it, gray it a bit more. And I suggest some boards like that. Not too much texture because the shack is further back. Also on the little structure there attached to that shack, I'm going to add that same color. And you can see that there's some texture. And it's a gray color, a grayed color on the shack. Pushes it back further. And then in the foreground, of course, I can add some darker color. And maybe a suggestion of some twigs and bushes maybe. Then warming it up a little bit, like a little too dirty. Then I can also pick up some color that's already there. Brush strokes going in different directions, keeping everything rather loose, as you can see. Not tightening up yet. Later on I'll tighten up a bit more. But I want that more loose, painterly look. And I'm using the charcoal brush in Photoshop. Color in the sky is a little too saturated, so I'm going to come down my little color selector and select the color that's a bit more gray. See what that looks like. That might be better. I'll pick up some of the blue and darken it a bit. A little too saturated, a little too dark. So something like that might be better. Darken it a bit more, keeping everything rather rough and painterly looking. So these are mostly midtones. The darkest darks and the lightest lights haven't been added yet. They come last. So I lighten the sky a little bit more and let some more of that warm color underneath show through. Try to put cool over warm and warm color over cool. It helps create more interest and a vibrancy is achieved. Only big shapes are put down, no details at this stage. Every painting needs to have a predominant intensity of color. So 1 degree of intensity needs to predominate the entire painting. If you add, let's say, a really strong color within a painting that has predominantly grayed colors, like I'm going to add now, you see if I added a red roof like that, that red is out of place. It isn't in harmony with the rest of the intensity of color. So to bring it in harmony, the intensity or strength of that red needs to be reduced quite a bit, like you see here. So you have to be very careful with the intensity of color. It can draw the eye away from parts of the painting that you want to have more importance. So if I did something like this, for example, let's say these are flowers here. You see how your eye is immediately attracted there? So that's out of place. It isn't in harmony with the rest of the intensity of the color, as I said. If you do add an accent, the accent shouldn't be that strong. So if I wanted a bit more intense red on the shack back there, that red needs to be reduced in intensity, but it can still be a bit stronger than the other colors in terms of its intensity, so that more attention is then drawn to that part of the painting. So it's something like this. Let's say that shack has a red door. So I'm adding that red, you see, but it's not very strong in intensity. It's more in harmony with the rest of the grayed colors, but a bit more intense. Not that much. Something like that. Otherwise, if I go too strong, then I end up with a more heavy-handed look. You see, that's way too strong, too heavy-handed, too dominant for this kind of more grayed predominance of colors. So by reducing the intensity a bit more, so something like that, that red acts as an accent, and because it isn't very intense, it aligns more with the intensity of the other colors. That is, it's closer in intensity to the other colors and therefore harmonizes with the other colors in terms of its intensity. But your eye is still drawn here, also because of the more grayed colors that are surrounding that red door of the shack there. Because all the colors are more grayed, there's a beautiful harmony here of colors, even though I have a blue sky which contrasts in hue with the red. There is a harmony of intensity of color because the sky color is a grayed color, and of course the ground and the building are also grayed colors. So the intensity of these opposing colors has been reduced, and that helps to bring them into harmony. Now I'm thinking of adding a fence on the ground here, and I'll make it blue, thereby repeating the blue of the sky down here. And see, maybe it's something like this, leading the eye back. It's a broken fence, and it also helps to break up that large shape, that rectangle shape there. So it leads the eye back like that to the center of interest, which of course is that shack. The shack itself is a bit crooked like that, not perfectly straight lines, which are very boring if that's what you make your buildings with, perfectly straight lines, very boring. But lines that are more irregular, add more interest. So something like that, and then let's say there's a dark shape here. Now I'm getting into smaller shapes, and I'm going to add a bit more color variation to the roof and suggestion of texture on the roof. Not too much, because if you add too much texture on an object further away, it will come forward too much, keeping everything still rough and loose. So the window there, I'm going to have it come up a little bit more, and I'm going to have the shadow underneath the roof come down a bit more like that. So now I'm connecting the window with the shadow. That the shack has to be made a bit darker. So something like that maybe. It's a little too dark, a little too desaturated. So, you know, these kind of value adjustments and color adjustments have to be made. And to make that dark shape even more interesting, I'm going to connect it with the little structure there, like that. You see, so all those shadows are connected into an interesting shape. And where that red door is, I'm going to add a dark right next to the door like that. And then where the little building is, I'm going to add a dark door there. Then I'm going to add a fence over here on this side, like this. So this is toward the end of the day, and maybe there are little hints of warm reddish light at the horizon, just a little bit like that. Adds a nice vibrancy of color to the sky, because I have the warm reds with the cool blues. And then way back in the distance, in order to give depth and atmosphere, I could add some blue mountains way back there. Just a suggestion of mountains in the distance. And they need to be grayed somewhat. And then further up on the ground, I'm going to add a bit of a cooler color there. So right there where the mountains are, you see, adding cooler color pushes that part back further, and some cooler color on the right side as well. So I'm going to go over that shack color with a bit warmer and a little bit more saturated color, like that, you see. And then I can start adding some smaller shapes at this stage, more detail. So value adjustments need to be made, and I think the shack is a little too light, so I'm going to darken it, and it'll make that door stand out more. And I'll darken the shadow underneath the roof a bit more also. So I want this shack to be a rundown shack. And I'm going to add a bit more saturated color to the roof, just a little bit, a hint of it, and that door can get a bit more saturated color. And I think I'm going to add another fence over here, broken down fence, like that. And then in the foreground, some bushes like this. Everything's overgrown. The land hasn't been taken care of. So I'm adding a texture here. And then back where the shack is, I'm going to add a lighter color. And there's this bush here. And so it's light against dark. The shack is dark against light. The light of the sky. So I'm thinking I need a texture over here, and I can get that texture in there with these rocks. You see, repeated different sizes like that, getting smaller as they move further back. Something like that. They lead the eye in, just as the fence leads the eye in and back to the buildings. And a few dark spots on the right side also, something like that. Adds interest. So now I'm going to turn this into an illustration. How can I do that? Well, by adding a figure. So I'm just going to rough in some kind of silhouette shape here of a figure. And maybe this is a lonely traveler and he's come upon this shack here. So he's going to do some investigating and find out what's in that shack. So I'm going to add some blue, just a touch of blue to his hat that he's wearing here. And let's see, maybe he's got a suitcase over here that he's holding on to. And that figure adds a lot of additional interest to this little rough sketch. And it helps create a story. This guy is wandering around and he's come upon this shack here. Or maybe it is his home. You don't really know. Let it remain a mystery. What's this guy doing here? And I can add some more interest to the sky by adding some birds like that. And it adds a small rhythm. And some blue is found within the cast shadow, which is the blue of the sky being reflected into the cast shadow of the figure here, as you can see. So the light is going to be coming from the right, upper right. So I'm going to get rid of this light that I added here on his shoulder. Also, what you need to do is to look at your art in black and white to see what the pattern is, and that's what I'm going to do now. And looking at this, I can see that I need to apply a principle of design called interchange, or alternation as it's also referred to. So where would I introduce that? Well, it needs to be introduced where the figure is. Why? Well, because if I add a light tone, the kind of tone that I have in the sky, the figure is going to pop out more. So I'm going to go back to the color and I'm going to add a light tone. Now, what color should it be? Well, applying the principle of interchange, a design principle, that color needs to be blue. Why? Well, because I have the red of the building against the blue of the sky. They're two contrasting hues. And down here, I need the reverse. I need the cool of the blue against the warm of the ground, the reddish color of the ground. So it's reversed down here. But up here, like I said, it's the red against the blue, and then down here it's going to be blue against the red. And by making it a lighter value, I'm going to draw more attention to this figure here. And as you can see, I picked up some of that blue from the sky. So this figure has these raggedy clothes on because the shack is rather raggedy looking. So naturally you'd expect a character to look rather raggedy also. And then I'm just going to quickly add some lighter and a bit more saturated color over on the right side like that. And his hat also is receiving a little bit of the light that's coming from the upper right. And I don't want the color to be too saturated because I want everything to be a bit more subdued in intensity of color. So I'm going to fix it up a little bit more later on. And immediately I think you can see that the figure is reading better now. And the eye is drawn to the figure. I can even add a bit more lighter tone. And let's see. I'm doing this really quick, as you can see. So something like that, and a bit more saturated, but not too much, so that he stands out better against the background. And I'm going to add a little bit of texture maybe on the right side. No, it's too much. There needs to be some more passive areas, and then some areas that are a bit more textured. Now, in addition, the shack value is too light. I'm going to darken it like this. Why did I do that? Well, by darkening it, the figure, the top part of the figure, stands out more. It's more value contrast, stronger value contrast. And then I can add a slight suggestion of light on the right side of the shack. Just a little bit warmer and lighter in tone over there. So I have to select the right color, maybe something like that. And that window is in the wrong place. So the right side is a bit warmer, a bit lighter, and then there's a gradation of temperature of color as well as value. So I'm going to bring down that window and darken it. So maybe right about there. That might be better. And then the cast shadow underneath the roof there needs to be darkened a bit. So where it's closer to the edge of the roof, there's an occlusion shadow occurring. So it's darker up there right at the edge than it is a little bit further down. Also, I need to darken the shadow on the left side of the building a bit more, and it adds a bit more form to the building. So this has 2 points of interest. Don't add too many points of interest. I wouldn't add more than, at the most, 4, but usually try to keep it to 2 or 3, with, of course, one of them being the center of interest. And in this little rough color sketch, the figure, of course, is the center of interest. So the figure is of primary interest, and then the secondary interest is, of course, the shack. Now, I could add a third by introducing, let's say, a spaceship near that little shack. And by doing that, I turn this whole sketch into a science fiction subject. And I'm going to make some additional changes here that you're not going to see me do because it would take way too long. And one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to switch or flip the figure so that he's facing in the opposite direction. And then I'm going to add a spaceship, and that spaceship is a spaceship that has crashed. And I'm going to add it over here, within that area there. So I'm going to show you what it looks like. I've already done the work. So I'm going to switch over to that other version. And here it is. So as you can see, there's this object, which is an alien spaceship that has crashed near the shack. And this character here has come upon this spaceship. The idea here is to juxtapose the more familiar with the alien, combining the two. So this is a very ordinary scene, and within that more ordinary scene, I've introduced an alien element. So I've turned this little rough sketch into a science fiction illustration. Now, this is not a finished piece of art. If I were going to turn this into a finished piece of art, there would still be many things that I would continue to change and refine the forms more, tighten up a little bit more so that it has a more polished look. But in this little rough sketch, as I've shown you throughout this video, I've introduced you to various principles of design, and these are the kind of principles that you need to be able to add to your art. And even with a little rough sketch like this, with the addition of these principles of design, this sketch looks visually appealing. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that the shape of this alien spaceship has these curving lines. You see these rhythmic lines, curves like that, with a straight here, and therefore this shape with these kind of lines contrasts sharply with the kind of lines and shapes that are found on this shack. And the kind of shape of the shack is more square-like, more angular-like, you see, like that, contrasting with the more curved and therefore more organic shape of the spaceship. And that adds interest, this kind of shape contrast, and also helps to draw attention to the spaceship. And this dark shape here, like this, I changed it a little bit, see, it's like an arrow. It tapers, it gets gradually more narrow, and therefore it acts as a kind of arrow pointing to the character there. The character, however, is the center of interest, and the character reads clearly. You can immediately make out that this is a person here, and your eye is immediately drawn to that character. And also, by combining and overlapping the shapes, I create an interesting overall silhouette shape like this. See, coming around like that, and around the character, then down like that. So that makes an interesting overall shape. This kind of irregularity to a shape adds interest. Now, there's more to be said about what makes this shape interesting, but I can't go into all of that here. The video would run way too long. Also, the principle of gradation is introduced on the roof here. You can see that this part is a bit warmer and lighter in tone, and then it gets gradually darker and cooler as it moves over to the left. So when you introduce gradation, that adds interest. Very important principle of design. Every part of the composition reads clearly. The figure reads clearly. The shack reads clearly. And, of course, the alien spaceship reads clearly. So this is just a little rough, quick sketch that I did, but it wasn't done that quickly. Even little sketches like this take time to do. Now, there are a lot of additional things going on in this rough color sketch that I can't get into because, again, the video would run too long. Now, the nice thing about working with the computer and Photoshop is that if you want to change the saturation, for example, of the color or the intensity of the color, I can do that easily here. And I think I'm going to reduce the saturation just a little bit. It was a little too saturated. Something like that, I think, works better. Now, another thing I want to point out is that always be aware of the negative space. What kind of shape does the negative space make? So, for example, the sky makes an interesting negative shape like this, you see? Every part of a composition needs to be interesting. Some parts need to be more interesting than others, however. See, that negative space makes an interesting negative shape, which helps to make the entire illustration more interesting looking. And there is this harmony of saturation of color or intensity of color that I talked about earlier. Now, another thing I want to point out to you is that there's a relationship established between the alien spaceship and the character. So how is that relationship established? Well, by direction. Now, you see, the direction of the alien spaceship is similar to the direction that the figure has, as well as the stick that the figure is holding there. And when you repeat a similar direction, you tie together the various shapes. A connection is therefore established. So that's one way that you can connect different shapes, tie them together. And that angle is also repeated on the shack. You see, right here, for example, and here, here, and even the post here, and of course where the fence is. So there's this repetition of direction, which helps to tie all the various parts together. That's one way that the parts are tied together, but in addition there are other ways also, like through the hue, the red hue that has been repeated with variation of value and saturation. So there are various elements that help to tie all of the parts of the composition together. Now there's more going on, but again, I can't go into all of the additional things that are part of this composition. Now, what you need to do when you think you're done, take a careful look at the painting and see where it can be improved. And if you look carefully and you know composition, you'll be able to spot some things that need to be changed. And I can see here, after looking at this for a little while, that there are some changes that definitely need to be made. And one of those changes is that the character here is too small. The character needs to be enlarged. So I'm going to do that, but you're not going to see me do it because, again, it's going to take too long. Also, you have to think about the size of different areas. For example, this area here, like that, is too similar in size to this area, like that, you see? So I'm going to change the size of this area here. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to bring that fence over to the left a little more. Then also, there isn't enough gradation of value in the sky. The left side is not dark enough. And the light side is okay, I think, but there needs to be this gradual gradation of value from left to right, getting gradually lighter as the value moves across the sky toward the right. Also, the mountains that you see back there, they look a little too green, and that's because of what is called simultaneous contrast. I want them to appear more blue. Simultaneous contrast can be seen here because I introduced that red, and the complement of red is green. Therefore, the color of the mountain seen against that more reddish sky will turn toward the complement of red, which is green. That's why you're seeing a greenish color here for the mountains. So I'm going to change that. I want that mountain to appear more blue, not green, since green is not one of my colors within this color scheme that I selected. And then some additional things I'll be changing as well. So I'm going to show you what those changes look like. And as you can see, I enlarged the painting and made some changes, some important changes. And one of those changes is, for example, the door that you see back there. Remember, it was red, but it needed to be changed to a blue. Why? Well, because there needs to be some blue on the shack in order to relate the shack better to the figure here, which is also blue. And by making that door blue, there's a stronger relationship established. Also, there's some blue over here on the shadow of the spaceship. And that's the blue from the sky reflecting into the cast shadow. So the shadow that you see here is being cast by the building. And then also here you can see that I added red, and that makes a nice accent because it contrasts nicely with the blue of the clothing and the door here. In addition, I darkened the sky, as you can see. So the right side is darker, and then it gets gradually lighter and warmer as it moves to the left. And also, the most obvious thing is that I flipped the entire painting. Why? Well, because the eye can more easily read something from left to right rather than from right to left, because that's the way we read. And also right here, you see, what I did was I took a little piece out of that shack. Why? Well, because by doing that, I make a more interesting shape like this, and I lock that shape to the background because the negative space is pushing into the positive shape, and that helps to lock the shape to the negative space. And as I'm looking at the blue door, I'm thinking, well, I could also darken that a bit more. Something like this, maybe. So his clothing, the light clothing, stands out better. And now that blue pushes back a bit more and is more in harmony with the low intensity of the red on the shack. So that helps to also make this part stand out more. That's receiving some light. Also, what I'm thinking of is to warm up that part of his clothing that is receiving some light. So it's more like that, you see? That works better, adds more interest. And the mountains back here that were a little too green looking now, I think look more blue. And why is that? Well, because I made them more gray. And that makes them look more blue because of simultaneous contrast that I mentioned. Now also, I want to mention again what I mentioned earlier in the video. If I make some part, let's say a little lighter, like this. If I make that part like that, a little lighter, now your eye is drawn to that part and away from the center of interest, which of course is the figure. So you have to be very careful. You have to make adjustments, slight adjustments, toning down an area more, or making it lighter, or making it less saturated. So if I do this, like I showed you earlier with the color, if I add, let's say, a slightly more saturated color here, like that, where there's a stronger light falling on the spacecraft. Now your attention is drawn up here. Again, you have to be careful. It all depends where you want the attention drawn to. Now, the hat that the character is wearing, as you can see, has a slight increase in intensity of color because I want the eye to be drawn there, and it is a yellow which contrasts in hue with the red of the shack. And of course the shack is much more neutral or grayed in color than the hat is, so the hat stands out nicely because it is a bit more saturated. Well, actually a lot more saturated than the color of the shack. So if I made something like this over here, if there were some red rocks or something like that, you see, immediately the eye is going to go here. It's going to be distracted from the figure. So it's very important that you carefully look at your painting and make sure that there aren't any areas that draw the eye away from where you want the eye to look. Any slight change can draw the eye away from where I want the eye to look. So I have to be very careful. I also added more birds as you can see up there, adds more of a rhythm. I also added a little window over here, repeating this window, adding a rhythm, and also that shape there is a rectangular-like shape. Well, actually, it's a bit more triangle, but it relates to the rectangle shapes here. So there's a rhythm set up, and also the repetition of the dark here and here and here sets up a rhythm of tone. It's actually more of repetition because I'm repeating the same dark here, here, here. It's repetition. And if I added some variation, if I changed the value of one of these slightly, so there's a slight difference in tone, then I would have established rhythm. But now I have repetition. Wherever there is the dark, and you can see the dark here as well, so there's a dark tone there, and here, repeating the dark that is found in those windows and the door, and up here also. So I'm applying repetition of tone. Also, some of the edges have been softened on the roof here and here, so they don't attract too much attention and help to push the shack further back. Also, the fact that the shack is grayed or neutral in color also helps to push the shack back in space, even though it is dark in tone. Also, there's some reflected light or bounce light that you see right there. Some of the red of the ground is being reflected into this lower part of his clothing. Now remember, this is a rough sketch. I'm thinking of adding even more interest to this area right here. And the way I can do that is by selecting a color that is not part of the yellow, red, and blue triangle color scheme. So I can go outside of that scheme, and the color that I'm going to select will become a discord color or a accent color. And I think the color that I'm going to select for the accent color is going to be a green, since I have the red of the shack and the red on his clothing here. Green is the complement to red. So I'm going to select the green here, and then I'm going to add a band to his hat. Just a slight curve, and then I'm going to warm it up just a little bit for the side that's receiving some light. Not too strong. I don't want it too saturated. And I think you can see that this adds more interest and helps to draw the eye up toward his hat. So it's a very small accent that I think adds interest. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to darken the painting a little bit. Something like that. I think that's what it needs. That's better. So I went ahead and made some additional changes. I saw a few things that needed to be changed, such as, for example, the stick was too straight, and a straight line is not interesting. But by making the stick crooked, it becomes more interesting. And also, since this is a male character, he looked too much like he had a dress on, so I gave him some pants here. And I broke up this shape, his whole shape, into a series of different sized shapes. So that's a different size than this one here. And I added that line going across, which breaks up that shape. So I have these shapes of different sizes. Then I have the big shape down here that contrasts in size with the others up there that are smaller. Then I have a small shape here, but then the other pants leg is larger in size. And then I have his boots that he's wearing. So there are all these different sizes, also his hair and the hat. And this variety of sizes adds interest to the character. So make sure you add a variety of sizes to your character. Now, one thing I will point out, and that is, remember how the shape of the shack looked when I first started drawing it? The shape wasn't very interesting, but then as the painting progressed, the shape became more and more interesting because I added an additional building to that shack, and then of course I added the spaceship shape, and by combining them like that, overlapping them, they make an interesting overall shape like that. To make a shape interesting, if it's not interesting, like the one that I started out with, which looked something like this, if you remember, I wanted a more flat view, but by adding that other building like that, and adding angles to the roof and other places, it became a more interesting shape, an overall shape like this that's more interesting. And with the addition of the spaceship shape like that, that made that overall shape even more interesting because of that irregularity. So if a shape doesn't look interesting, just combine it with another shape and it will become more interesting. Now, I will also point out that I made this part here a bit darker. It looked a little too light and attracted, I think, a little too much attention. And also your eye is going to be drawn into the painting starting down here because of the stronger value contrast of the cast shadow against the lighter value of the ground. So your eye is attracted down here, and then of course led right to the figure, and the figure or character is looking at the spaceship is pointing down, so your eye is moving down, and then these shapes here that you see, they act as a kind of arrow that leads your eye back to the character here. And of course these stones, they lead the eye back to the character, and so does the fence. It leads to the spaceship, which in turn, because of the shapes down here, lead your eye back to the character. This shape here, this darker shape, is an arrow-like shape that I pointed out to you earlier, which leads your eye to the character. Also, the fence here, I made a change there, had this board come over more, which is pointing to the character. And of course, the stronger value contrast of the light value against the darker ground draws your eye to this character. And the fact that he's large in size and in the foreground also, of course, attracts your attention to that character. In this video, my main focus was not so much on showing you my process of painting, but more on trying to make you aware of the importance of principles of design, that you need to get those principles into your drawings and paintings. That's what's really going to improve your art tremendously, if you're able to get those principles into your art. And it's not as easy as you might think. That's where you're going to need to do a lot of work to try to get those principles into your work. First of all, if you don't know them, or you don't know them very well, you don't understand them very well, then of course you're going to have to learn more about the principles, gain a deeper understanding of them, and how to apply them to your drawings and paintings. That's going to take time. That's going to take a lot of effort on your part and a lot of study. There are many more principles than the few that I pointed out to you here. So the more of these principles that you can get into your art, the better your art is going to be. All the great illustrators that you admire, all their great illustrations that they produced, that you're in awe of, all of these illustrators, they knew these principles and they were able to get them into their illustrations. That's what made their illustrations so visually interesting, so visually appealing and exciting looking. And these principles also will help you to communicate what you want to say in your illustration. Now it's time to end the video. For those of you who might be interested in wanting to take an art course and go beyond watching free videos and what you can get from free videos, you might want to check out my complete illustration art course, as it is called, at my online art academy art school. You'll be learning a lot more about these principles through my course. Matter of fact, you're going to be learning about every part of picture making through this course. So why not come by when you have some time and check out the course, and you'll see all the various things that the course will teach you. If you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel yet, I would really appreciate it if you would do so. And please tell all your friends about my videos, my YouTube channel, all the people that you know that are interested in art, that want to learn about picture making. So please let them know about my videos. And if you were able to watch the entire long video, congratulations to you. I'm sure you have the art spirit within you. Goodbye, and thanks for watching.